producing this, Kirk, or at what point do you start recording it?
I actually just hit the record button, so it's starting.
Perfect. All right, so you'll each get an email after the webinar and the opportunity to go back and listen. There will be plenty of things worth hearing twice and sometimes more than that. I am glad to say that I do know each of you personally who are on the call. You're here because I believe you have an important part to play in improving the state of affairs here in Alaska. And I've asked Kirk to come in and help us figure out how to do that, because he has done that in many other states and has a lot of lessons that I think will be very important for each of us. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself here, and I'm going to let folks start to introduce themselves. I'm going to unmute people one at a time. If you can just give me a quick, 15, 20, 30 seconds at the most, introduction that you would like to introduce yourself to the rest of the folks here on the group. You already know who I am. I'm newly elected, going to be a first-time legislator here in a few weeks, and looking forward to working with each of you in one way or another over the next year, and hopefully a lot longer than that. So let me unmute Jared. Jared, can you introduce yourself, please? Well, Jared is still muted, so let's skip over Jared and let's go to John.
Okay, my name is John Faulkner. Thank you, David, for arranging this. I'm live in Homer, Alaska, resident here of the state of Alaska since birth, so that makes me, 56-year resident of Alaska. I've got 5 kids. I ran for office against Paul Seaton in District 31 in 2012. I'm currently district chair of District 31, and I guess that pretty much sums it up. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And Juanita, let me go ahead and unmute you here. I'll mute John, and I'll go on down the list. Juanita, go ahead.
Well, thanks for bringing everybody together for this, and that's what we need so much more of, I've been noticing lately. I'm Juanita Caselius in Eagle River, and I'm running a group that protects the permanent fund. So you can find the group, it's on Facebook, at Permanent Fund Defenders. So I invite everybody to look at that.
All right, very good, and thank you, Juanita. And Jared, are you, nope, you're still muted. I'll wait for you to unmute.
Oh, sorry.
Don, go ahead. Oh, good. Go ahead, Jared.
All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Jared McClure. I live here in Anchorage, Alaska. New staff for the newly elected Representative-elect David Eastman. I've been to many of these political training schools over the years and highly, highly recommend the schools put on by the foundation. I recommend that you give Kirk your 100% of your attention. He's one of the top men in the field, and I'm glad to have you all here tonight.
Thank you, Jared. And Don, go ahead, Don.
Hey, thanks, David. I'm Don Jones. I'm a almost 28-year Air Force veteran, retired military intelligence officer. Came back here to Alaska because this is home. When I married my wife back in '99, that was or 2000, that was the agreement, is that she would follow me wherever the military took us, but when I retired, I would come back home. Now we're looking to try and make sure Alaska stays the great state, or continues to be the great state that it is, and do some good out here.
Amen to that. Thanks, Don. Ernest, go ahead.
I'm Ernest Crotts. I worked in the legislature for 5 years as a staff both in the Senate and the House. And then I met Dave primarily through my dad and uncle when they were working on the Republican state conventions. I guess that was back in like 2008 or 2009.
Thank you very much, Ernest. And Debbie, go ahead, Debbie.
Hi, this is Debbie Leamer, and I am here in Juneau. I've lived in Alaska since I was in second grade, and I have 2 grown daughters, and I am new staff to Representative-elect David Eastman.
Yes, you are, and we are looking forward to spending time together in Juneau. Thank you, Debbie. Victor, go ahead.
Yes, good evening, David. Thank you very much. My name is Victor Leamer. I am a longtime resident of Juneau. I've been here since 1974, or 72, excuse me, where I met my wife. And so essentially I will be support staff to David Eastman's support staff here coming up in this next. I work for the state of Alaska. I do procurement, and I work part-time at a local radio station. Firm believer in Jesus and ready to find out what he's got in store for our state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vic. And we have, let me go ahead and mute folks again here. Okay, good. We have one other attendee on the call. Actually, we have 2 others, John Nelson and Tuckerman Babcock, but neither of them have chosen their audios, so I do not have the option of calling on them at this point. But I will give you a brief rundown since I know both of these gentlemen. John Nelson is the founder of Liberty First Alaska and has been very active in the liberty movement here, especially out in the Mat-Su area. Proud to call him a friend and also look forward to him doing some good things with that organization here over the next however long he is willing to do that, hopefully a long time. Tuckerman Babcock, also a newly elected GOP chairman here in Alaska, and had a chance to spend some time with John and Don and Tuckerman on Saturday at the State Central Committee meeting. Talked about what this next legislative session has in store for us. We can talk about that more later, but I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Kirk now. Thank you for the time to kind of give us a feel for who's on the call, Kirk. I know everyone has their own experiences and perspectives, and not all of us are going to agree on everything. I'm sure there's plenty of things to disagree on, but by and large, I know, having worked with all of you, that you would like to see Alaska move in a conservative direction, and you're willing to put time and blood and sweat and tears to make it happen. So that's why you've been invited onto this call. Kirk, love to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, David. By way of introduction, I'm Kirk Shelley. I currently live in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. But my dad was Air Force, so I actually did spend a few years up in Alaska at Anchorage and at Elmendorf. So at least, when you start talking about Homer and all these other places around, I know what you're talking about. So I know that, at least that much. I've worked in grassroots politics now for close to 31 years. I got my start really in college, but I went to East Carolina University. That's where we ended up when my dad retired from the Air Force. And I've now worked in about 49 states. For some reason, I have not done a project in Vermont. But other than that, I've worked either legislative projects or election projects across the country in virtually every state. Let's see. A friend of mine forced me one time to count up the number of races that I've worked in, and we came to the legitimate total that it's 292 races all across the country. And surprisingly enough, I have a winning percentage somewhere around 85%. But most of those wins are actually by less than 1.5%. I have a tendency to pick very close marginal races, And but that's been one of the very cool things about my experiences is I've got to make more mistakes than any of you guys will ever conceive of making. And as a result, because we do really good follow-up with our stuff, and we do 4 things, basically. We try to do careful planning, prepare our resources, all set up so that we can act in real time. But the most important part is at the end, evaluating and figure out what we did right, what we did wrong. And I've had some great bosses that really forced me to do that, and that's what's helped me figure out a lot of what you're going to be learning today. And you're just going to benefit tremendously from my single-handed crusade to push the frontiers of ignorance to places that you've never even thought of going. So, I may be a little bit embarrassingly self-disclosing as we go along, trying to explain to you some of the major mistakes that I've made over the years. And the point of it is to try to help you figure out, help you learn from my mistakes so that you don't have to repeat them and you can keep on doing great and more things. That's the goal. So let's dive right into, the real nature of politics. And by the way, going back to something that David alluded to, this is not a class on what to think in terms of political stuff. See, political technology is ideologically neutral, and that this stuff works just as well for the Democrats, the Republicans, socialists, communists, neo-fascists. Matter of fact, I borrow heavily from their stuff. I mean, if they're doing something right that works politically, I'm going to steal it. One of the better web pages out there was actually put out by Obama's former staff on the marketing side. It's called The Cave, and I highly recommend visiting that particular site. It's a PowerPoint where they talk about Obama's last campaign and the work that they did with social media and the internet, et cetera. And it was first-rate stuff. I was taking notes like crazy during that presentation, trying to learn as much as I could. So I keep trying to learn from, even people that are my ideological enemies, which kind of gets us to one of the points that we try to make at the beginning of our classes. We don't normally allow recording of our material, and nor do we like to have it posted on Facebook, etc. Because, look, what you're doing is if you do that, is give the enemies a list of your tactics and what you're trying to accomplish and why. And that's never a good thing. So this isn't stuff that we want to be giving to our political enemies, but instead, this is stuff for your education and for you to help develop, sub-leaders as you go along, and people that are going to help you out. So that's what it's for, but be careful about who you train, because your tactics can be used against you, and I've seen it happen to me over the years. So don't try to prove how smart you are, just try to utilize it best you can. So we're talking about the real nature of politics. The most important thing you got to do when you talk about the real nature of politics is kind of define terms. So what is politics? Well, it comes from the Latin, poly meaning many, and ticks, which are blood-sucking parasites. And it's tough to do jokes when you're online, but I'll try. That's really not the nature of politics, and most of us kind of know that one. Now, when I'm talking about politics, let's first of all define what it isn't. It's not looking after the common good. And politics is not about looking after your fellow man, and it's not blind allegiance to a particular political party or their candidates, and it is certainly not the art of compromise. Those are some of the popular views of it. And believe it or not, hang on a second. It's not about serving Christ. That's hopefully my motivation for being involved in politics, but it is not what politics is. So when we're talking about politics, we're talking about simply the adjudication of power. We're figuring out who is going to rule whom. And I know that, those of us, particularly in the conservative side, start clenching at the spinal level when we start talking about giving somebody power over us. But that is part of the reality of living in this world. Whenever there's a dispute between two people, there's going to be a tiebreaker. And that tiebreaker can be who's bigger, who has the most guns, who's meaner, etc. There's a lot of different ways of figuring out things when two people have disagreements. But that process of figuring that out is politics. And the idea of politics is to figure out how to win. Somebody's going to rule, ultimately. And that process of figuring out who's going to rule whom is politics. It is not the art of compromise. It's the art of confrontation. And whoever does it better wins. So what we're going to be talking about is a mobilization confrontation model that actually works. And every time it's tried, and that's what works in politics. Unlike every other aspect of your life in this world, politics is really the only zero-sum game. If David had got 49.9% of the vote in the election, he could not go down to Juneau and say, look, I represent 49% of the voters of this particular district, so I want a 49% say in how the budget's drafted. And if he did that, they would laugh him out of the legislature. Because, look, you either win or you lose. Somebody, ultimately has got to be in charge. And every state except for Nevada, because there they have a none of the above option. But every other state, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. If you don't believe me, look at the last presidential election. It was the only time I can think of when 70% of America really wanted none of the above. But, they had to make a choice. Somebody was going to win that election ultimately. And when they do, they get all the goodies. So that's what politics is all about. But that's the way it is in the United States. See, in the rest of the world, politics is not decided, the process of figuring out who is going to rule whom is not decided by reason. It's not decided by constitutional restraints. Instead, it's, the machete is a tool of political change. In all the areas, controlled by the Muslims, particularly in the border areas, politics is settled at the edge of a gun. The winners come in, kill the men, rape the women, and enslave the children. That is the way politics works in most of the world today, unfortunately. In politics, there's always an inherent threat of violence, and we saw that following Trump's election. The Ferguson riots, the militia takeover in Oregon. States, have been known to fight back. We had a little bit of unpleasantness in the 1860s. Some of you might remember. There was some very draconian stuff that just happened recently in Wisconsin, where there was a thing called the John Doe warrants for people that were supporters of Governor Walker. And they had literally SWAT teams kicking down the doors of political supporters of Walker, taking out all their computers and records, etc., and holding them indefinitely. In politics, unfortunately, there's just no safe harbor. However, that also means that if you do nothing, they get to do whatever the heck they want to with you. So, it's always there. There's always an implicit threat of violence in politics. However, in the United States, we are more blessed than you really know, when you really think about it. The system is actually designed to allow the peaceful settlement of issues. We don't have to have Arab Springs. We don't have to have, revolutions. We don't have to have colonels taking over the government. On January 20th, there's going to be a peaceful transition of power, from Obama, to Trump. And there's people that are, trying to goof that up, but there actually will be a peaceful transfer and that nobody's going to have to be shot. It's a brilliant system of checks and balances. I mean, it is designed deliberately for slow change. Powers diffuse to the various levels. And while we often lament the fact that the Congress and the courts often don't recognize the fact that there's a 10th Amendment in there, there really is. And it's difficult for the federal government to come in and try to enforce laws locally without the aid of the local law enforcement. And there's competition between the various branches of government. The states battle the feds. The executive battles the legislature, battles the courts. Gridlock, in other words, is good. The system is designed for very slow change deliberately. No man can become an emperor in our country, and it's designed perfectly because, look, if we have one of those stupid parliamentary systems like they do in Europe, where when you get elected and your party wins power, they get all three branches of government. And as a result, you may have conservative governments for a generation, and all of a sudden you get some goofy socialists come in and they nationalize everything. Then the conservatives come back a little bit later and they take power and they get half of your freedom back. And that is why they're losing freedom at the rate of incredible, and why we have as much as we do have nearly 250 years after our country's founding. And our system is not excessively corrupt. Now look, that is not to say that there isn't pockets of corruption in our system. I mean, I have worked in Louisiana. I've seen it firsthand. I've worked in Chicago. We did a flyer drop at a cemetery hoping that maybe those guys would maybe give the Republicans a shot. It does, but when there does, when you find corruption in the election process, you've got a couple of options. You can either try to figure out how to get more votes than what they're trying to steal. You can expose it and make it more expensive for them than it's worth. Back when I was working in New Mexico many years ago, I was working down in Las Cruces, very close to the Mexican border. And there was a precinct called the Tortugas Precinct. Never forget it. I went driving through it and only counted 8 houses, all cinder block, virtually nobody there. Yet there were 700 people registered to vote. And under New Mexico law, you cannot remove somebody from the voter list unless they do not vote in a presidential election. And there were some people at the Tortugas Precinct that have been voting at that precinct in presidential elections since the 1800s. Surprisingly, all with Hispanic surnames. And every year, their signature changed. And what became pretty darn obvious was that people were coming over the border and they're voting illegally. So what do you do in a situation like that? Because I knew that it was going to be a close election in that particular precinct. So I borrowed a friend of mine's, INS at that particular time had a van that was very distinct green. And I parked it between 2 trees so it couldn't get towed out, but it wasn't decaled. So I could park it there. And it was an amazing thing. People would come by, to go vote at the Tortugas Precinct. They would see the INS van that they thought was an INS van, and they ran off in horror. And as a result, instead of having 800 people there voting illegally, only 27 voted. As a result, all those names got purged off the list. And it made Las Cruces politics much easier to do. So when you see those pockets of corruption, expose it. Figure out some way of, turning it around to your advantage, or trying to figure out how to get more votes. It's never an excuse, not to participate and not try to figure out a way to win. It's just one more puzzle. Well, if politics is about the adjudication of power and figuring out who's going to rule whom, well, what's power? Well, real political power, when you get down to it, is forcing politicians the way you want or replace them. I look at politicians as interchangeable parts. If one of them's not working, you just pull it out and you put in a new one. And you keep on going until you get the things done. That's what political power is all about. But there's a danger where people confuse access to a politician with power. And there's a difference. And if you confuse the two, well, then you're going to be wasting the next hour and a half or so. See, there are people that are involved in politics who get really excited when the congressman returns their phone call, or we get a chance to meet with the governor. And that's not power. The problem is, once you get caught up in the access trap, you have a tendency to get addicted to it. And you don't want to change politicians, and as a result, you can't force them to vote the way you want to because you don't want to lose that access to your friend. See, access is simply, and you can tell these folks, they're the ones who just want to be listened to. They want to have a seat at the table. That makes them relevant. They want their phone calls returned. But when they do that, you become a sycophant. You're never perceived as a threat by the political class, by the politicians. They just know that, okay, all I have to do is talk to them, pretend that I'm listening, and they'll be happy. And that's not power. That's a social club. What you are basically is this little dog at Thanksgiving sitting at the end of the table, hoping that maybe you'll throw them a couple of scraps. And occasionally, the people that have access occasionally get a couple of scraps. But that's not my goal. See, I want you guys to be the pit bull that jumps up on the Thanksgiving dinner, grabs the turkey, and if they feel nice, maybe they'll give the politicians a couple of scraps. That's power. That's what we want to help develop in your. That's the mindset that we want you to have at the end of this call. See, in politics, you can be feared and therefore respected. And look, if you are not politically feared, you are not politically respected. The other option would be you can be loved. However, you will end up being always manipulated by the political class. That's the problem with folks that have access. They're loved, but they're forever being manipulated by politicians and those that serve them. Write it down, guys. Unless you are politically feared, you are not politically respected. And that should be kind of the motto. Now, how do you get power? Well, there's two paths. Well, the one that most of us are really familiar with, anybody that's ever watched a couple of episodes of The West Wing know that the only way to get power is to be, elected. The way, the direct personal path to power. That's how you get power. They're the ones who have their hands on the lever that makes things go. They're them. They're the staffers, basically those that, serve the politician, the lobbyists, the elected officials themselves, the corporate ideological types, giving lots of money to these guys, and the bureaucrats. That's a path to power, but it's not the only one. See, most politicians most activists stop right there. They think this is the only path they've got, and it isn't. Because when people that are on the direct path, and those that serve them, you're either working for the politician or you're running for office. And there are other alternatives. The people on the direct personal path to power, that is completely dominated by access. They don't have any leverage. The thing, people think that, I have access to the politicians. I can pull strings. Well, the problem is strings pull both ways. Now, that's not to say that it is completely stupid, that there's not benefit to having people on the direct, personal path to power. It's nice to have somebody like, David Eastman and others, that are in the legislature because we do need them. But not everybody needs to be doing that in order to have power or to have an effect on the legislature. And look, while I can, if you're working for a Right to Life group, if you are trying to protect the permanent fund in Alaska, hiring a lobbyist is not, an access-based lobbyist, somebody who's served in the legislature. That is not going to serve your interests well at all. They're not going to be able to put themselves on the line for your particular cause. But however, if you are an accountant and you are, trying to get a very small thing done to the tax code, and nobody cares about that particular issue, it's not controversial, then hiring an access-based lobbyist actually makes sense in those situations because, nobody's going to care about it, but nothing's going to happen unless it's pushed. And they need somebody that can sit there and push through non-controversial stuff. But, so they do allow non-controversial things to happen. Whenever, a lobbyist access-based group is pushing something, it ends up getting watered down or completely killed because, when things get controversial, politicians don't want to do anything. And nobody can push them. If you're on the access-based track, you cannot push the politicians. Okay? So much for access. Let's talk about the other path to power. And one I think is far more powerful than the access-based. However, it is not well understood and it's not talked about, and they don't make TV shows about it. The bad news is there's not only no safety in this one, we're the ones who become targets of lawsuits, and we will never show up in the history books. But it is much more powerful. This is called the indirect path to power. What my goal is to control the political environment that politicians work in. If you can control the political environment of those who are on the direct political path to power, in essence, you control them. Anybody that's ever done one of those terrarium experiments where you got the milk jug and you got the little frog in there or something like that, and you control the environment by making it hotter or colder and seeing what the frog does when you do that? Well, in this case, the politicians are the frogs, and you're the guys on the outside controlling the political environment. When you create a situation where politicians want to vote for more gun freedom, or they want to vote against tax increases because that's what the people want. That doesn't come by accident. There are people on the outside that are creating the right political environment. When you do that, you control them. And when you realize that, oh, wait a second, if I make things painful for a politician to do bad things, politics becomes at that point mechanical. It becomes understandable because, it's almost like Pavlovian dogs. Every time you ring a bell, the politician starts to salivate, because you're controlling the environment. So our goal, our job is to become, through mobilization, to become agents of conflict on the outside, therefore controlling the political environment of those who are on the inside. And most of these people. I mean, you've probably, wondered in the past, with the unions and the mainstream media and stuff like that. They're the ones that are on the outside, right? Look, maybe you. There's two theories of those of us who are on the outside of how to get politicians to actually pay attention to us. One of them is education, and that is a way of creating political change. Most of us got interested in politics at some point because somebody, we read something, we saw something on TV, saw it on the internet, and it made sense to us. And, and that is, a way of creating change. But the one that I'm going to be really preaching on and harping on is the mobilization and confrontational model. To me, education is a servant of mobilization. Let's talk about education and why education alone and why that is not the most effective way of creating change. See, some folks think that if we want to have change, the first step is to educate the politicians. And you can tell these folks because they use certain phrases. If we could just get the legislature to understand blank, whatever issue you happen to be pushing, then they'll have to support us. Or they'll start talking about educating the people. You know, if we get enough people behind us, they're going to have to pass it. We'll hit a tipping point. And at some point, victory will fall into our ever-eager fingers. For instance, you know, I've run into people that thought, you know what we're going to do to change the culture in Washington, D.C.? We're going to go get constitutions, and we're going to pass them out to the politicians. And heck, we'll even give them a test. And, you know, if they pass it, you know, then we'll support them. And if you want to really frustrate yourselves for the long haul, just keep trying to educate politicians to the righteousness of your cause. You know, and they will listen and they will nod approvingly and they will say, yes, you've got many great points. But at the, you know, moment of truth, they oftentimes, you know, will go to their default position, which is the one that's probably not yours. Try to think about this as far as educating the members of your own family. How many of you people just, you know, you just came out of Thanksgiving and you were sitting around the dinner table, and how many of you got a staunchly liberal member? And how many political conversations have you had with them over the years, over many Thanksgivings? And how many of you converted from being a fierce political liberal to a fierce liberty activist? Yeah, I haven't either. If you can't convince your own family members to the righteousness of your own causes, what makes you think you can completely change the mind of a complete stranger? And then you've got the problem of how do you reach all those complete strangers? Well, I got an idea. Let's send a letter to everybody in your state, every address that we can possibly get. And then, you know, we'll send them a letter, and then we'll blog about it. And our letter will, you know, there's a stunningly well-written, well-reasoned letter. And that will convince the people. Okay? So if you're going to do it to all the households, guess what? You know, if you send them a letter, 95% of them ain't going to read it. You know, and if you get, you know, response from somewhere around 5% in a positive way, you're a dang genius. But most people sort their mail over the trash can. And if they don't read your mail, you know, blogging about it ain't going to make a difference either. But look, and I understand why the education theory is attractive. It's easy. It's not controversial. It's fun to write this stuff. It's soft. Nobody yells at you when you do it. And it's safe. Nobody puts you in jail for writing blogs. But it's not the most effective way to make a difference. I mean, think about, you know, the principle of right to work. Right to work means you cannot be forced to join a labor union as a condition of employment. 80% of the country supports the idea of voluntary union membership. Yet most workers in this country live under the threat of forced union dues every single day. I mean, how in the heck do you educate your way out of this one? You know, we've already got 80% of the population. What's the tipping point if it's not 80%? And look, you know, on the other side of the coin, think about it this way. If you look at, you know, not so much in Alaska, but if you go to the rest of the country, you know, states like Florida, New York, and New Jersey, you know, and you ask them, you know, do you think it's okay to confiscate the guns of private citizens until we can prove that they are worthy of carrying them? And you will get close to 80% of those folks saying, yeah, that is a good darn piece of public policy. Let's make America safer by taking the guns out of honest, law-abiding citizens. You know, people that are pro-Second Amendment are definitely in the minority. Well, why don't they confiscate our guns? Because they're terrified. Because they know gun owners can get immobilized pretty darn quickly. You can't educate your way out of any of these situations. You have to really concentrate on the mobilization side. See, public policy is not made by public opinion, and it never has been. Obamacare would have never passed if that was the case. The bailouts certainly wouldn't have happened. Taxes would be reasonable, not 49 to 58% of your income. I mean, your number one thing on your family budget is not your house. It is taxes. Now, in some ways, be glad that it isn't made by public opinion, because if it was, if they had a public vote on whether you should have a gun or not, forget it. That we lose almost every single time when that's on the ballot. So gun grabs would go through. Redistribution is always popular. I mean, I know there's some principled libertarians who are going to vote against it, but if you think you're going to get a free lunch, most people kind of go along with it. And look, environmental policies. I mean, if the debate becomes, do we want clean water or not? Not sensible, policies, but basic green stuff. Forget about it. If the debate's over clean water wins. Or one of my personal favorites, the minimum wage. I mean, if there was ever a thing to guarantee teenage unemployment and great inconvenience to the vast majority of the citizens, it is the minimum wage law. There's just no way you're going to be able to convince most folks that that thing really needs to be repealed. Never underestimate this power, of stupid people in large groups. I mean, do the math. 51% of the population is below average. Think about that when you drive home. But when we talk about education, I'm not saying that education is necessarily an evil. I just look at it as the servant of mobilization. It's not a substitute for mobilization. See, politics is unique in that it is a numbers game. Really most things are numbers games when you really get down to it. But when you really grasp the fact that, look, this is mechanical. This isn't mysterious. Politics really breaks down to simple math. In the policy, the ability to win is often made in the small margins, creating small changes of people's behavior. That's what makes a difference. So let's take a look at what electoral reality was and is. See, when you're looking at the education theory, we have to look at, okay, the universe is everybody, 100% of the population. And in order to win, we have to get 51% on our side. But in politics, there's certain people that just don't count politically, and you don't have to pay any attention to whatever the heck they think all the time. You can completely ignore them. People that you can completely ignore are non-citizens. That doesn't mean just illegal aliens. We're talking about non-citizens. You can get rid of those guys because they're just not eligible to vote. And you can also get rid of, convicted felons in most states, not Maryland and, New York, but in most states, they're ineligible. They lost their voting privileges once they committed a felony. And the biggest prerequisite, if you're a citizen and a non-felon in the United States of America, is you have to have been breathing continually for 18 years. And if you're under 18, you don't count. So basically, that depends on the district. This is a hypothetical example. This isn't, completely across the board. I mean, it's going to change a lot. If you're working in New York City and you're working in a district, in a major metropolitan area, guess what? That number is actually going to be much bigger because it's full of non-citizens, lots of convicted felons, and lots of minors, people below 18. So, maybe even a smaller percentage of folks vote. However, if you're in like Arizona, around Phoenix, where there's lots of retirees, where there's, lots of people over 18, very few felons, etc., may actually be bigger. But roughly speaking, across the country, we only, about 60% of the population right now is eligible to vote, which means to win, you really just need 30% plus one. But that's not true. See, in most of the country, you have to do something in order to be able to vote, and that is you have to register. And that, it's not mandatory. That's not completely true in North Dakota, where they have no voter registration. Weird state. But anyway, when you get down, only about 40% of those who are eligible even bother registering to vote. So in order to win, geez, you just need 20% plus one. But that's not even completely true, because look, think about election day and what we call turnout. And when they say, hey, this percentage of the population, we're expecting a 20% turnout or a 50% turnout or a 70% turnout, they're not talking about 70% of the nation as a whole. They're talking about 70% of those who are eligible, who are registered voters, are expected to turn out. So in this hypothetical example, let's say we're having a really good turnout, and so, we're getting maybe 40% turnout or 60, so. Of the population, we're now talking about 24%. I mean, when you think about it, if you know, get a pretty good idea of who's going to turn out on election day, you've just saved yourself 76% of your mailing cost if you're trying to send out a letter to everybody, because you can eliminate 76% because they're not registered and they don't turn out on a regular basis. But you can even make it smaller when you think about it. Because look, there are places in the your state where you can pretty much determine the Democratic base vote. In this example, we're going to say about 8% are part of Team D. They for whatever reason, I can tell you, there are parts of Oklahoma City that are going to be voting 80% Democrat. Doesn't make any difference who's the candidate. That's just the way things are, particularly in the Black and Hispanic side of town. And there's places like where I live in a Republican ghetto in northwest Oklahoma City, and I know with certainty that it is impossible for a Republican to get less than 80% of the vote from my particular precinct. And I know this because many years ago, a convicted child molester was on the ballot, and he got 80% of the vote from my precinct. Not because we like convicted child molesters in my district. It's just this: how many people here vote straight party Republican? Doesn't make any difference who's on the ballot. And there are those folks, bless their hearts, who will, thinking that, the Constitution Party, the Libertarian Party, that this is our year, and, they're not voting 2%, that keep voting for these independents, not based on principle, not as a protest vote, but because, they really think that their party is actually going to win sometime, which, if you run into those people, don't walk away from them. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. Our system is deliberately set up to be a two-party system. But, guess what? If you're part of Team D, or you're on the Republican plantation, or you're that 2% that keeps voting for these, goofy candidates just because you think they actually have a chance, you don't count as far as politics is concerned. See, if you're a Republican, you know that they're going to vote for you. The Christian right is part of the Team R plantation. Doesn't make any difference who's on the ballots. They're going to somehow manage to figure out some way of figuring out how to vote for this guy, and they're going to vote Team R. And when you're on the Team R plantation, all the politicians want to do with you is shake you down for donations and try to help you, get you to volunteer, and maybe they'll try to remind you to vote on, that day. But they don't care about what you think or what issues you care about, because they know ultimately you're going to come home and you're going to be part of their team, so they can ignore you. Which means when you break down all the math, it really boils down to 3% plus 1. In American politics, all you have to do in order to win, in order to have power, is to figure out who those people are that are in the, that's undecided category. They're what we call in politics in play. They're willing to change their voting behavior based on a candidate or issues. And, if we can find those folks and mobilize them on our issue, now we're in the position of being politically feared. Let me give you an example of how that's work plays out with somebody that, you may not think, they're not on our side. But, the homosexual law. Every statistic I've ever seen shows that only about 2% of the population identifies themselves as exclusively homosexual. Well, why in the heck are the political class always pandering to them? Why would they only care? I mean, look, if you think about it, that 2% is vastly dwarfed by the Christian right. They've utterly smashed them every time, if there was a ballot measure between, the homosexual population and the Christian right, who's going to win? The Christian right, because there's much more of them. But why did the political class pander to the homosexuals and not to the Christian right? Because Christian right is over here on Team R. They can ignore the Christian right because they know they're going to vote for the Republicans. Now, who are the homosexuals? When they see themselves as an embattled minority, why would that make a difference? Well, they're in play. They're, on average, better educated than the average citizen. Hence, they make more money. They have no kids. And for those of us who have more than 3, the number one indicator of poverty is over 3 kids. Something I wish I may have thought about. I don't think I would have got stopped, but I have 4. So they have more disposable income to get involved in politics. And when they are pushed and they feel like their rights are being trampled, they will vote single issue. And they're mobilized. They will actually change their voting behavior. And look, if it's not, if the homosexual issues are not on the ballot or have not been an issue, guess what? Many of them own small bistros. They don't want to have an increase in the minimum wage. They don't want to have to be paying higher taxes. So, that may be voting Team R, unless, the Republicans kind of tick them off. So that's the type of thing you got to keep in mind. And if we can figure out a way of identifying enough supporters where we reach a point of 3% plus 1, we win. And I dawned on me the day that we passed Right to Work, and I kind of broke down the numbers. It dawned on me, if we had close to 500,000 supporters in our state on our list, which was about 3% of our state's population. And, as a result, we could pretty much take out anybody that we wanted. And we did. We knocked off over, politically speaking, for the humor impaired and the NSA who's probably monitoring the call. The final count was like 44 members of the state legislature lost their seats over the Right to Work issue. That gets their attention. That's political power. Now, think about this a little bit more. We start talking about, turnout models and stuff like that. GOP primaries, good turnout, maybe 20% of the registered voters. And when you talk about, the percentage of people that actually, you can actually have a major impact in GOP primaries and township elections with a smaller group of folks. And generally speaking, political success in the long term is going to be determined by the number and the effectiveness of the activists on either side. And the reason why I think we've been losing so much over the last 40 years is the left has been doing a much better job of mobilizing and much more effective activists than we've had on the right. And that is the long-term goal for success. 3% plus 1 is actually doable. When you think about it, think about trying to go into your own neighborhood and trying to convince, say you want to have I'll create a local town ordinance that will allow people to have a howitzer in their backyard. If you tried to get half of the people in your township to go along with that, that would be like pulling teeth. However, if you realize that you only have to get 3%, to agree with you on that one, nor to have political power. That's what makes a difference. And that's why small hinges can move very big doors. Now, this isn't a perfect model. There are variables that you need to consider. Voter turnout. Is it, presidential year? Is it, local elections, is it school board? That type of stuff. The more local the election, the lower the turnout. And with turnouts in primaries is significantly lower than general elections. What's the partisan mood of the electorate? A few years ago, Mary Fallon was running for governor, and I really didn't like her. She voted for the bailouts. And so we did, with some friends of mine, some very hard-hitting mailings coming, toward the general election. And, she was the low vote getter that year. And in any other year, she would have been tagged out. We would have been able to knock her out with no problem. However, it was the first year post-Obama and Obamacare. It was a Republican tidal wave, and every single county in Oklahoma voted against Obama. So, sometimes you get a partisan mood swing, or, on the other side of the coin, the years following Watergate, very bad year for Republicans. Some candidates are so darn good or so darn bad that, it's almost impossible to beat them. I mean, if your last name rhymes with Kennedy and you're running in Massachusetts, it's going to be tough to beat you. That's just the reality. And then there's certain single issues that, are more important than anything else, over anything. Post 9/11, it was darn difficult to get rid of an incumbent. I mean, we had just been attacked, and nobody felt like changing horses. And I think it was like a 99% incumbent return rate that particular year. So these are things that can change the realities of politics. Now, there are those folks that want to win the election by trying to do a voter registration drive at Walmart. And when these people show up, run, don't walk from them. I mean, look, the reason why is simple. People don't register to vote because they don't care. And if you register them to vote, they won't actually show up on election day because they don't care. And even if they do vote, who knows who they're going to vote for because they don't care. Now, occasionally, though, rare candidates come along who do convert I don't cares to I cares. Some examples, well, not him. I mean, this guy is a genuine from care to I don't care converter. He's kind of unique. But, Obama in 2008, the guy was supernatural. When you see a supernatural candidate like that and you're on that side, you want to be registering folks, because it's an opportunity to expand your base. Ron Paul, not only in 2008, but 2012, managed to get a bunch of I don't cares and turned them into I cares. So when you have that type of situation happen, utilize it. Expand your universe. Get more people involved. Sometimes certain issues can do the same thing. Obamacare has been tremendous as far as bringing new people into the movement. The bailouts and the Tea Party movement, was another example of how, it took a bunch of people that I don't care and turned them into I cares. Now, when we're talking about the real nature of politics, we have to talk, at least for a few minutes, about the nature of politicians. So let's think a little bit about how they think and what they do. Politicians, by their very nature, are nice. They don't like confrontation. I mean, that is really their biggest skill set in many ways. This is the kid that was between a C and a D in algebra and they got an A because they're just so darn nice. Because of their ability to get along with people, it makes them more apt to compromise. Most of them, when you talk to them one-on-one, and this is a danger point, by the way, when you talk to them one-on-one, they actually do have ideological convictions, but they can be swayed if they believe that they could lose their election by sticking to their principles. Because to them, losing an election is death. Winning an election is life. And they can't save America if they can't get elected. And if they're convinced that if they vote for your gun policy, they're going to lose their seat, they're not going to vote for it. They may support you, but they're not going to vote for it at the end of the day. So always keep that in mind, that's, who they are, what they're trying to do, and, and why they may vote against their own principles, their own stated principles. That's why everything keeps getting sucked to the center. I mean, it's very rare that there's a politician that's willing to push against that swirl where everything's going to the center. The late Ted Kennedy, Ron Paul when he was in Congress, those guys would push against it. But most of them just keep getting swept right into the mushy middle. Politicians are like Pavlov's dogs. It's understandable. Politics is understandable because politicians are understandable. And politics is actually predictable because the politicians are. You can control politics because you can control politicians by controlling the political environment. You control the environment, you control them. But it takes force to stop that pull toward the middle. And force can come in one of two flavors. It can come in the form of pleasure or pain. And I have a real strong bias toward pain, and I'll explain why that is a much more effective motivator. But I used to smoke for many years. And initially, what got me into it was, the pleasure. I thought I was looking cool when I was smoking. But what kept me in Philip Morris's back pocket for many, many years was the pain and withdrawal symptoms. And same thing works for politicians. Pain is a much better motivator. Now think about your own job for a second. If you just show up at work on time, do you get a raise? No. If you do just simply what your boss asks you to do, does that mean you get a special reward? With your kids, do you give them a cookie every time they listen? No, that's the minimum. Voting to protect the liberties is never an extraordinary accomplishment. I mean, that's just the minimum. And for that, you get the absence of pain. That's why we don't like to give praise to politicians, because that gives them political pleasure, and that's dangerous. Whenever you give them cover like that, that's something that they will use for the rest of their political careers. There's a potato chip called Utz out that's in the eastern part of the country, and they had on their label for years, voted best snack food in America. And in the fine print it said, as voted in 1908. So, they took, that one award and they used it for almost 80 years or so before they finally took it off their label. So be careful about telling, everybody what a great guy is because he voted right. That's the minimum. You only talk about, politicians when they do something wrong. You create a hall of shame for those that voted against your bill. Now I'm going to give you a checklist, and this is important. And what we're going to talk about is political things that are pleasurable to politicians. And things that are pleasurable are tangible, real things that tend to lead to their reelection or what they perceive as life. And things that are painful politicians, which are real, tangible things that tend to lead to their defeat or, into the politician's mind, their death. So things that are pleasurable to a politician. They love getting good press. Their name's spelled correctly in the newspaper, saying that they're doing great things for the district. They get to go to the Rotary Club, and they get public praise, and everybody talks about what a great guy they are, and they love that type of stuff. And they like actually being in the center of attention. They are a celebrity. People love them. And when somebody endorses them, or better yet, attacks their opponent, in their mind, telling the truth about their opponent, that is stuff that might lead to their political life, and they appreciate it, and they like it, and it makes them feel good. Their idea of the ultimate election, and this may be the only way that you could get me to run for office, is if I got over there and realized nobody else is going to be running against me. Then I'd probably run. But, if they have no challenger in the election, they get to go to Disney. Life is good. Jim Inhofe, U.S. Senator from Oklahoma. I'm not kidding. I was at a public event, and he was talking about how he needed volunteers at the headquarters. And I was like, Jim, the only person you've got running against you is some, goofy independent who's only raised $300. Why in the heck should people spend time? He said, because I'm top of the ticket and it's important. The guy needed validation by volunteers. Volunteers are actually very valuable, though, for most campaigns because they are substitute for money. And that, the more volunteers you have, the better chance you have of creating a win psychology. They're good things. They love to be able to change the rules and do gerrymandering and stuff like that to help keep themselves in office, things that lead to their life. They love to be able to manipulate the rules. I've got great stories on that, but I'm not going to share them tonight. But, it is fun to be able to manipulate the rules to hurt your political enemies. And also to make sure that, if you can, manipulate the Ethics Commission to investigate your opponent's finances, all the better. But the real pleasure for the average politician is money. Not only money for their campaign, but money for the district. So when they have money for the district, they can, buy support. And you might think, oh, you mean like welfare payments? Yeah. Welfare payments is a way of getting money for the district, yes, but also money for public schools because there are people that do, there are good Republicans who do landscaping work and janitorial contracts and build roads and buildings and stuff like that. So, these are all things that tend to lead to life for the politician. And if you want to cause a politician pain, and David might become a victim of this. He would like to get money for his district. They're taxpayers; they deserve stuff too. But if David goes up against leadership, he might find out that money ain't coming to the district because of he's causing, and that can cause pain for David. So these are all things though. When you look at these pleasure things you can do for a politician, you can actually do a lot of it. I mean, you can raise money for the campaign. You can, get volunteers. You can talk people out of running against them. You can do endorsements or attack opponents. You can hold events where they're the center of attention. You can give them public praise and try to get them good press. These are all things that you can do. But the thing about pleasure is it's momentary. Once they've had that, puff of the cigarette, they need the next one. And that may or may not be you. So let's leave the distasteful subject of pleasure for a politician. Now let's talk about the fun stuff, which is pain. And the cool thing about pain is, unlike pleasure, it's not momentary. It can go on for a very long time. And this is really a checklist for anybody who's involved in confrontational politics, because this is really your toolkit. These are the things that can lead to a politician's death politically. It can cost them their seats. Bad press, is a step toward getting them, creating pain and, might start leading to their defeat. When they show up at events, they're not getting public praise. Now they're getting embarrassed. So you're protesting their event, and you do that enough, and it starts to get their attention. If you flyer drop an event that they're in, where you send, give literature to folks, and you make this guy a pariah in public, people start ignoring them, that's painful. That may mean that they may be fixing to lose their seats. And instead of being endorsed, there's actually a public campaign of denouncements attacking it. That might be painful. That might lead to my defeat. And instead of no challengers, you've got a challenger, especially in the primary. People that, gee whiz, don't you realize that there's an 11th commandment that Reagan talked about? What the heck are you doing running against me in a GOP primary? They might lose. especially the low vote turnouts, and you've got enough people mobilized. Or third, the legitimate use of a third-party candidate is act as a spoiler to give people a safe place to vote if the wrong guy wins the primary. When you're, for the gentleman who's head of the GOP, one way to get a politician's attention is to, do a censure vote from the, Central Committee attacking a particular politician by name, because that's kind of a signal to them that they might be having a primary challenge because they voted wrong. That is a pressure point. And while you can raise volunteers to help a politician, you can also recommend that they not show up. And when there's no volunteers at the headquarters, that starts to scare them. One of the things that the other side does, those that are in leadership will often do, is kill all our guys' bills and their projects in their districts. That's a tangible thing that could lead to somebody's defeat. And the lack of money. I mean, many states check the applicable law, do not, and you can mail even the federal election list of they list everybody who's contributed to a particular candidate. Now, you can't ask them for money or to join your organization in most states, but you certainly can let them know how this guy is voting. Now, not everybody's contributors are ideological contributors. Most of them, are given because they know the guy who's running for office and they like them personally, and some of them are access-based lobbyists that are going to give PAC checks to whoever leadership tells them to vote, give them to. But some of them are ideological contributors, and they may not be they may be very upset in a way the politician voted, and they may not give them quite as much money as they used to, or none at all, if you inform them of it, and that is painful. But the single biggest source of pain to a politician is demonstrable proof that there are large numbers of angry voters. And this comes from mobilization. This can be, that there's a mob outside their office. It could be large numbers of phone calls, emails, letters, etc., faxes that have come into the office, all these things that come out. When they see large numbers of angry voters, politicians are not very good at math. I mean, you can look at the budget deficits across the country to realize that politicians don't do math very well, and they don't necessarily do percentages, and they're not going to be able to figure out, is this 3% of the population of my district or not? But they know when there's large numbers of angry voters that are being mobilized, they have to be scared. They have to worry about their seats. Especially when it is an orchestrated campaign. And that point was driven home to me. I was in the Republican caucus one time, and this freshman legislator came into the Republican caucus and threw down a stack of postcards and said, look at this. All these pre-printed postcards. This is nothing more than an orchestrated campaign. And the Republican majority leader, who'd been there for about 30 years, said, yeah, dummy, and that's why it's dangerous. Because if they can mobilize during the legislative session, do you think they can do it around election time? And the freshman's blood ran out of his face, and he kind of realized, yeah, you're right. This is an orchestrated campaign. That's why it's demonstrated. Politicians can often withstand these, grassroots groundswells that just appear out of nowhere. They may give lip service to it, but they're not really scared of it because it's not orchestrated. It's not controlled anger. Somebody pops up spontaneously and disappears spontaneously. But when something's orchestrated, that makes it extremely dangerous. And when you can create large numbers of angry voters that you can control and reach out to, that's change. That is something that could lead to their death, politically speaking. And that's really your biggest checklist that you've got, because you can do all those things that can cause pain for a politician. Think about it, the Alcon Highway. You've got a politician with his face down into the asphalt, and you've got your hand on his belt loop, and you've got him picked up, and you keep walking toward Anchorage, and you got a long hunk of highway, you can create a lot of pain for a very long time. And that's what you can do. Politicians are not idiots. We're all pleasure maximizers, pain avoiders, and they will try to avoid pain. Number one thing you learn as a politician when you get elected, as soon as you do something, you're going to make somebody mad. So their first thing they want to do is as little as possible. Or, better yet, they can claim that they're taking action when they really do nothing. For instance, they can do a non-binding resolution saying that the Second Amendment is in the Constitution and we support it. And by the way, I'm a hunter. But they haven't done anything for gun rights. They can create a task force, Citizens Actions Committee, to get involved in this particular issue. What have they done on policy? Well, nothing. But, it looks like they're doing something. Or, in Maryland, they created the Citizens Corner that allowed, the Tea Party activists to come over at the city council meeting and complain and tell the politicians what they were doing wrong. And that was kind of a buy-off because the politicians then, kind of nodded like, oh, thank you for your input, and then ignored them. Or, they sometimes get away with making vague public statements or pronouncements about a particular issue, but there's nobody outside to hold them accountable and force them to get clear on that. The greatest force in politics, well, no, it's not, maybe a close second, but that's not the biggest force. The biggest force in politics is really inertia. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest unless force is applied. And when I'm talking about force, I'm talking about political pain. And, politicians want to do nothing. That's their goal. So, and that's actually a plus. If you're on the defense, if you're trying to keep politicians from doing something, that's a good thing. You make something controversial enough, politicians don't want to vote on it, it goes away, and you win. That really does play into your hands. But it kills you, though, when you're on the offense. And if you're trying to pass the right to work law in Alaska, that's a long uphill slog. You've got to really change, got a bunch of politicians that don't see any reason to change things. It's almost impossible to convince them that, look, if we pass right to work, a bunch of new jobs are going to come flowing into Alaska. Really? How many people you think are going to, move up to Alaska just because you have a right to work law when they've got all these, they've got 26 down south. Not cheaper to be down there. So that's tough fight. Remember, the system is really designed to move slowly or not at all. That's their goal. So our job, when you're doing mobilization, the way you force change is you've got to create ways of getting politicians on record. And the best proof of how a politician really believes is by forcing them to take a roll call, public stand or a roll call vote. So that's what we want, is we want to force roll call votes. And we want to sponsor not resolutions or not meaningless stuff, but bills with teeth. Things that would arrest federal officials who try to do illegal things on Alaska soil. We're trying to push them to take immediate action, not, we're going to balance the budget in 14 years. No. We want balance now. And we have to connect totally, completely within the minds of the legislature that there's no difference between what happens during the legislative season and what happens during the election season. In their minds, they have to be forever linked. If you don't think that politicians don't link them, think about what they do. They go over to Juneau, they vote whatever way they jolly well please, completely ignoring the citizens back home. Then they come home and they sound like, Ronald Reagan, even though they just voted like Walter Mondale when they're down in Juneau. And that's because, this is our fault as activists for allowing them to have a disconnect in their mind between what happens when the legislature is happening and what happens during the election time. We've got to make them completely linked. And politicians have to know over time that there are going to be consequences for their bad political behavior. That's our job. So we have to utilize that 3% plus 1 principle. how to hold, to realize that, we've got to identify a group of folks that are roughly equal to about 3% of the expected turnout. Embrace the fact that this is not an ideas game. Politics is about numbers. And accept the reality that if you cannot say something bad about a politician, it's best to say nothing at all, because they will forever use that as cover. Remember, the midpoint of a line is not determined by where you put the dot. The midpoint is created by the two ends. And if you move the political debates over to the right, you're moving the middle ground over to the right. And that's where the sucking sound is, where they're all getting squeezed toward the middle. If you're moving it over to the right, that place where they're all getting sucked into is also moving to the right. And that's what we have to do. Now, not only do you have to worry about elected officials, you have to worry about those who serve them, what I will refer to as the political class. Now, when I'm talking about the political class, I'm talking about elected officials, I'm talking about the access-based lobbyists, I'm talking about even grassroots groups that really think that the way you win is by being really nice to the politicians. That's, any of those folks that are serving the politicians or the politicians are members of the political class. And they will tell you how to behave. And they will explain to you how politics really works. There's a question you need to always ask yourself. When a member of the political class tells you how politics works, if I believe them, and I did what they said, how would it benefit them? And once you really grasp this concept, when you ask yourself that question, whenever somebody comes up to you and says, you can attract a lot more flies with honey than you can with vinegar, you can think about it for a second. That's great advice if you want flies, but I want freedom. That's not what my goal is. Or also, politicians will often tell you, you're hurting your own cause. You send one more of those letters into my district, and I'm going to vote against you just out of principle. What you need to think about is, okay, if I really believe that was what they were thinking and that's the way they were going to behave, and, what does that mean I have to do? Well, in order to get their vote, I've got to quit sending out the letters. Well, if I quit sending out the letters, how does it benefit him? Oh, all the pressure goes away. And then they're free pretty much to vote the way they want. Always ask yourself, if I did it, how would it benefit them? And that will probably give you your next course of action. Now, when you start pushing the politicians' buttons and you start putting pressure on them, they have a tendency to behave in a very rather predictable way. What their goal is simply they want you to go away and give you as little as possible. That's what they're hoping for. So, and this is funny, in every state that I've worked in, this seems to happen every single time, almost exactly. It is amazing. The first thing they will do as you're starting to build up pressure is they're going to try to ignore you. And if they ignore you and you just say, well, I guess this isn't working, and you quit, guess who wins? They do. They've won. You've gone away and they didn't have to give you anything. Okay? So you're made of sterner stuff. You're a little bit more stubborn than the average person. So you keep putting the pressure on them. Well, the next thing you do is you may get a phone call from them where they may ask you to show up at their office and they will try to appear to be reasonable. And they'll invite you in, be nice, tell you what a great person you are and how quaint it is, and, gosh, it must be nice to have a soul and stuff like that. And, many activists, once they get kind of called in and told, what a reasonable, nice person they are and how cool it is that they're involved in stuff, they may quit putting the pressure on. They haven't gotten the vote yet, but, they go away. And if they do, guess who wins? Politicians. So you decide to keep putting pressure on them now. Next thing you will probably get is a whine about, you're just asking too much. golly, we got to do, yeah, I agree if we got to do something, but we can't do this now. And if you buy their excuses, guess who wins? They do. You've gone away and, you've quit putting pressure on them, and they get to vote their conscience. I don't want them to vote their conscience. I want them to vote my conscience. If you keep the pressure on, at some point, they will probably try to threaten you. And these threats can come in many forms. They will threaten to investigate your organization. They will say, look, any more of these letters and I'm going to vote against you. These type. And look, some politicians are better at threats than others. I mean, I've had some that have almost got me under my desk in the fetal position. And I'm warning you, there will come a threat at some point. That is usually a sign that you're doing something exactly right. Once they threaten you, your goal at that point is to double down. Whatever the heck you did to get them to the point where they threatened you, try to do more of it. If you can triple down, that's fine with me. But, put more, that's when you really want to up the pressure dramatically, because now you've really got their attention. When they start threatening, when they're not being nice anymore, and they're threatening, it's going against their character, that's a sign that you've really got their attention. They are scared for their political life. So keep the pressure on. If the threats don't work and you're keeping the pressure on, they will often have other people try to threaten you. And that threat can come from, whoever they think may be credible to you. A friend of yours, if you're a pro-life group and you're putting pressure on them, they may have the other pro-life groups come up there and say, oh, dearie, you're such a, good heart activist and stuff like that, but you're just being counterproductive and you're hurting your own cause, and you need to throttle it back. And if you believe that person and you did what they said, the benefit would be to the politician, the pressure quits. So they're having other people threaten you. Now you really got their attention. You want to keep the pressure on. At that point, they may try to buy you. Now, they may try to buy you, they're not going to offer you cash, but they may probably offer you things like, why don't you write acceptable legislation? Let's get you a seat at the table. I want you to be my conscience on this particular issue. Let's put you on my head of my citizens advisory panel on this issue. Maybe they'll try to even offer you a job on the campaign staff. They will try to figure out some way of buying you off cheap without having to go on record on your particular issue. And, that is a danger point. Be careful of it. When they're trying to offer you things as opposed to voting correctly, they're attempting to try to buy you off. If you withstand that in the bribe attempts, they may vote your way, or they may not. But at least you've got them on record, and you know who to target and who to get rid of down the road. Now, they will offer a host of excuses for not taking action. They'll let you know that, look, I'm with you completely, you just don't understand the political realities here. I got to appear to be reasonable. Why are we pushing this thing? The governor won't sign it, the courts are just going to kill it anyway. Well, here's what political reality is. If we do this, we're going to get something worse. And one of my favorite things was from the NRA one time when I was pushing for constitutional carry, and they said, look, don't you realize, you idiot, that we don't have the votes? And if we push this thing and it goes up for vote and the gun grabbers realize that we're in the minority, my golly, you know what's going to happen? They're going to confiscate every single gun. By you pushing for constitutional carry is going to lead to gun confiscation. The reason why they haven't confiscated the guns is they don't have the votes for that. One of my favorites is when they look at me with a straight face and say, you're the only one talking about this issue, which means metaphysically right now, at this time and space and reality, right now, eyeball to eyeball, you're the only one talking to me about this. They're ignoring every single email, phone call, and every other conversation I've had. You haven't done your homework. Let's work this thing out. These are all excuses for not taking action. I don't know if you guys remember this phrase. The American people aren't ready to pass pro-life legislation. You guys haven't created a culture of life. And that was W. talking to a bunch of pro-life activists, blaming, here's the most powerful man in the entire world, telling a bunch of pro-life activists who bleed this particular issue and blaming them because they haven't created a culture of life. And it's like, well, wait a second, dude. Why aren't you doing what you should be doing, which is, using your bully pulpit and talking about, the importance of protecting innocent life? Some other good ones. Hey, look, I'd love to do this, but the federal government won't let us. I think, you got a good plan here, but we can't do it all at once. We got to do it incrementally. We'll pass the bad bill, but we'll get it fixed up next time. Oh, wait a second. In order for me to support this bill, you have to get Representative so-and-so to support this bill too. And look, we just don't want to burn the whole house down by your silly plan. Don't you realize it's better to get half a loaf than nothing at all? This is the best we can do, or we'll lose. Yeah, right. Rome wasn't built in a day. Socialism wasn't erected overnight. And yeah, we'll probably lose. So what? They'll ask you to draft the acceptable legislation. Or, they'll give you, say, hey, look, what we've got here is a constructive Republican alternative proposal, otherwise known as crap. Basically they're compromising the bill down to nothing, and there are people that will take that as a victory. But it's inevitable. There's nothing we can do. Nothing is inevitable. It's only inevitable if no one fights it. In 2016, dangerous ID was stopped in 3 states because people fought it. All of them were state. One of them had already passed in Kentucky. It already passed both houses of the legislature. The governor had done a teleconference saying why he wanted dangerous ID, and yet he ended up vetoing it after we put enough pressure on him. Medicaid expansion, which was inevitable in a bunch of states last year, stopped because people fought it. Nothing is completely inevitable. It is possible to change history, and you should strive to make that happen. Now, politicians will make certain threats. They'll attack your credibility. That's not how we do things here. Usually said with a southern drawl when I'm working in those states. If you do that again, I'm going to vote against you or your issue. They will threaten you with lawsuits and investigations. They'll have the media look into you or the ethics commission. They'll let you know that you're only hurting your own cause. So the question is, what's your price? Look, if you're, and the big thing for access-based lobbyists is being invited to all the dinners and events and, to rub shoulders with all those folks. That has never been my goal. And that hopefully is not yours. It's the funniest thing. You end up with really horrible parking places at every major event or having to get to the Capitol. You don't get to be on their advisory committees. And be careful about, being offered campaign jobs too. Because once you start that, you take the campaign job, and your guy gets elected, then, but you gave up your other job. So now you got to go, make income, and pretty soon you're going to be working for people like McCain. Be very careful with friendships with politicians. The best friend in politics is a dog, not a politician. Personal relationships are dangerous, usually ending up in disaster. Think about it. What's a friend for? There's somebody you can take advantage of. Be very careful of, hanging around with the political class too, and the access-based organizations. Now, just because, you have a good working relationship with somebody does not mean friendship. I go to, a large church here in Oklahoma City called Crossings, and the governor goes there. I think 12 state senators and a whole bunch of state reps, the mayor, etc. And, and I have pretty good working relationships with about all of them. It does not mean that I'm friends with them, even though I go to church with them, because, that is not my goal. I do not want them to have a position where they think, because we go to the same church and we're friends, that they can somehow ignore the causes that I believe in. There are champions, and if you ever attend one of our one-day schools, I will explain more about who champions are and why they're different than your average politician. Think about what these guys are doing when they're being nice to you. You're beating them up in their district. They're getting mail, and they're getting hateful phone calls at all hours of the night from people that are really upset by their behavior in the legislature. And they're suddenly being really nice to you. Look, when they're doing that, they're either gathering political intelligence or to see if you're the type of person who would be swayed by just saying some nice words about you and trying to get you into the access space fold. Proverbs chapter 23, written by Solomon, the smartest guy of all time. Now, keep in mind what Solomon's job was. He was in the king business. This guy is a ruler. And he said, when you sit down to dine with a ruler, note well what is before you. Put a knife to your throat if you're given the gluttony. Don't crave those delicacies. That food is deceptive. And he could say that because he was a ruler. Since people brought him gifts, if he's laying out delicacies for you, if he's basically giving you gifts, he wants something. So be careful. That's why he's warning you. Put a knife to your throat, because if I'm doing that, I'm trying to get something. The verse before that, though, earlier chapter, last verse of chapter 22 says this: "Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men." And I think that's important. That while the words are inspired, the markings of the chapters are not. And I think that actually goes to the first three verses of chapter 23. See, you're not going to be offered goodies unless you're really good at what you do. And if they ain't offering you goodies, that just means you got to get better at this. You're not there yet. But when they start offering you goodies, that's a good sign you're doing good stuff. What will happen to you at some point, and I've seen this happen to many good activists, and if you stay in this long enough, you're going to see it too. You get some guy who's elected as a local firebrand or head of the Tea Party, and they are showing up at these rallies, and they're in the politician's face, telling the politician exactly, this is what the grassroots want, this is what we demand, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And then instead of being the grassroots representatives, at some point they start showing up at Tea Party meetings, telling us what we have to put up with. This is the best deal that we can. And they start echoing the excuses of the political class. And at that point, you've become the politician's representative to the grassroots, telling us what we have to settle for. When that happens, the game's over. They've traded power, their chance for power, the chance to win policy for access to politicians. And that's a sad day when I see that happen, because that's when they lose their effectiveness. And David, I'm going to let you, hopefully everybody gets back up online. That ends it for, our discussion on the real nature of politics. And I appreciate you guys being with me as long as you have been. If you have any questions, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. I'm trying to pull up my dashboard here so I can see what's... No, okay, good. If you have a question, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One of them is to raise your hand. You see a little hand button there. And, I can unmute you. Or you can type it in to the question bar, and we can see it that way. Either one works. David, if you're still on, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am still on. And can you tell people where to go to raise that hand?
Yeah, it's on the little tool thing. If you see a little orange yellow arrow, if you've made that thing small, you can make it bigger by hitting that, and you'll see a little hand signal there. Yes, Juanita. Let's see if I can get you unmuted here. Okay,
Yeah.
you're unmuted.
Okay. So, have any of the
Okay, yeah.
I mean, do you know that the
Juanita, I'm not able to hear what you're saying. You may need to type your question into the question box.
Well, Juanita's.
yeah, you can.
Juanita's fault. You're digitizing. Your internet connection is like not keeping up with your voice thing while you've got stuff up on your screen. So that's why we're asking you to type it in. David, while you're doing that, Juanita, David asked a question. Let's see. Do you run against a legislator who voted the right way after everything that we've done to put pressure on him? No. Look, there's a guy in Oklahoma. He's a congressman by the name of Tom Cole. And this guy, if you looked up under the Wikipedia, the political establishment, his face would probably pop up. The guy has no soul, would never vote correctly on any issue that I can think of, but he does vote right on everything that I've ever asked him to, or actually my members have asked him to, because he is a smart enough. He's got his PhD in statistics. He knows numbers, and he realizes that if properly motivated, I could mobilize a whole bunch of people that could cost him a seat, particularly in a Republican primary. But all he has to do to keep that from happening is vote correctly. I kind of make a joke about politicians is that you don't have to worry about praying for them because they have no souls. They have given that up, because of their ambition. That is the driving force. Not their love of anything else except for their own political ambition. And while that is hyperbole, it's a jest. There's an element of truth in that. The average politician is not going to vote right because they believe in their hearts of hearts that's the right thing to do. They're voting because of their self-interest, or at least how they perceive it. So if they're voting right, I'm not running against them because that sends the wrong message. I want the other members in the legislature to realize, look, all you have to do to keep us from hitting you time and time again is just vote right. If you vote right, we're going to leave you alone. Pretty soon they take the absence of pain as pleasure. And once we get to that point, we're doing good. Yeah, and Don was adding to that point, saying, one of the things that you have to do when you were, putting pressure on, a legislator and stuff like that, is you have to do the hard work of recruiting somebody to run against them. Because rule number one of politics, an election, winning an election is you can't beat someone with no one. So we have to be able to find somebody in the right party in the right place in order to run against them. Well, I'm apologize that we couldn't get the voice thing on. Were you able to type in the question?
Yes, there is a question in the chat window from Juanita.
Okay. Oh, that is yours, David. Can you read it out to me?
Yes. So she mentioned we don't have an election related to the huge battle here with politicians working to access the permanent fund and dividend here. How would you pressure them in this? Just contacting them directly, petitions, organizing for the next election now? And so I gave a partial answer there.
Yeah, one of them, like you've got a good issue to actually start developing large lists of folks. And if you contact Ted Patterson, he can introduce you to our online petition tool, which will help you to start easily gathering up names of like-minded folks. And, and for a good cause, we've got a rather large list of email addresses that, would, love to work with you on as far as, being able to, send them out, on your behalf and, start attracting, like-minded folks so that you can start talking to them. So if they do make a move toward the permanent fund, you can put pressure on them very quickly. So that's, one of the things, we can help you with. And, one of the things that we do at the foundation is to help, good activists to do that. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this call, but we've had other calls that are on our list, but, that have been recorded that you can listen to and find out how to, utilize these tools. And, that's probably for you a very good first start. And, so you're mobilizing and preparing so that if they do try to assault the permanent fund, you've got people that are of like minds and you can unleash pain on them very, very quickly. And David, I'm talking, so it's difficult for me to always be listening or be reading all this stuff at the same time. A lot of moving parts. So if you see a question, please feel free to read it out loud.
Sure. Yeah. That'll have to be a quick answer to Juanita's question for now. Who else has another question? Well, if you do have a question, feel free to type it in or raise your hand and we will unmute you. My typing my question in the chat window was just because I know in this presentation we didn't get a chance to really go into that part of it. And honestly, Kirk, I think you did a masterful job of squeezing, a couple hours of work into a couple minutes in several parts of the presentation here. So very well done there. And I know it when you have the more time, there's a whole lot more there, and you get to fill in a lot of the holes that are just there because there isn't enough time to go into it.
Our one-day school is like a fire hose of information, but it is hopefully well worth your time, and I hope at some point down the road you'll attend. This is basically an introduction. The one-day school goes into a lot more details into the next steps as to how to, run your organization, how to work at the Capitol, how to get people involved in the fight, and how to make a difference around election time. So this is just the introduction. The other part starts filling in the rest of those gaps and probably some of the questions that you might get or might be having. Well, David, with that, I've not seen any other questions, but let's go ahead and sign off. It's past my bedtime here in Oklahoma. So
very good. Thank you very much for staying up late for us, Kirk. Really appreciate it, and hope to get you back up here to Alaska for a class at some point in the near future.
Yeah, next time I go up there, I'm just not going to just do some sightseeing. I want to do some serious fishing.
Hey, all right. Well, then you've got a calendar to work on because there's a lot of times during the year when that's a possibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
January isn't one of them usually.
No. And you're not going to get me up there during the breakup either. That's not going to happen.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate your time. I know your time is valuable. Really appreciate that you shared it with us this evening. Hope you all have a good night.
Thank you, man. Bye.